going to shut the door. We're ready? Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time today. We're going to be talking about making domestic finance work harder. This event is being organized by the African Food Systems Parliamentarians Network. Honored to be working with them, and I'm Oshani Pereira from the Shumba Center for Food and Climate. I'll be your moderator today. The event is going to be in English. The next event, I promise, will be in French. We will have the next event in French. And we have an exciting panel up, and they're already debating on a number of things. We shall get started very quickly. But before we do, I want to explain to you why the African Network of Parliamentarians is very concerned about domestic investment. Firstly, it's about productivity. If you don't have domestic investors involved, you can't build your financial and economic productivity. Secondly, it's about longevity. Domestic investors have a long-term and a very deep interest in the domestic economy. They will take political risks, they'll take currency risks, they'll take legal risks that generally foreign investors shy away from. And thirdly, domestic investors are very important because they are you and me. They are working with our savings. They are working with our pensions. They are working with our salaries. And they're working with our children's future. So if they are not involved in sustainable development, in climate finance, in food security, in biodiversity protection, and monetizing eventually the ecosystem services being provided by biodiversity, then we're in a pretty bad place. And we all tend to overestimate the power of finance. So if you take the word currency, for example, currency comes from the Greek word kurir, which means run or to flow. And if you take money, the Greek word is monē, which incidentally means to won. So money is a current. It runs through society and it ignites when risk and return find some sort of equilibrium. and then it kills when it doesn't. What money doesn't do is it doesn't give you the wisdom to deploy. That comes from here, and that comes from here. Very important, those two places. And that's what we're going to unpack today. How the domestic environment needs to have this and this to deploy money wisely. And it's not about a green transition. It's not about a sustainable development transition. It is about the transition, because we do not have any choice in this transition. It is ongoing, and it's happening now. So let's begin, and I would like the speakers to feel the pulse of the room. Okay? So tell me, ladies and gentlemen, take a guess. If you look at all the overseas development financing that's available in the landscape, can you take a guess how much of that is being deployed through domestic financiers? Banks, insurance companies, intermediaries, microcredit providers, leasing companies. How much do you think is being provided through them? Take a guess. Someone wants to take a guess? Mr. Lusuba, would you take a guess? Give me a percentage. 3%. To be very precise, it's expected to be 4.9 in 2023. So we have a long, long, long way to go. Well, this is going to be unpacked by Ahmad Bahalim from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Ahmad, I remember you telling me very carefully, we are very, very, very keen about additionality. We are intervening in places where businesses are falling short and where governments are falling short. And you have a massive portfolio at the Gates Foundation, going from tech to extension to support services. What are the three main areas where you're seeing market failures in Africa and you're intervening now?
Thanks, Hoshani. I hope folks can hear me. I'm competing with the event next door. I'll be brief, because I like being brief and you're more likely to remember what I'm going to say. So I'll offer you 4 issues that we're struggling with rather than 3. For us, as a private philanthropy that is Seattle-based, we are very cognizant that our resources are very modest in comparison to the need. So internally, we are continuously trying to figure out how do we have greater impact than the resources that we bring to the table. Our resources, again, are modest in comparison to the need. So earlier work that we've done with Shamba and prior colleagues showed us that we need roughly $14 additional billion of ODA in this space. We provide $550 million. That's peanuts. That's not going to get us there. So fundamentally, we have to work with partners. It has to be private, it has to be public, and it has to be intergovernmental or multilateral. We have to bring everything to bear on this particular problem. Now, I'll dig in a little bit on a point that Oshani breadcrumbed, the 4.9% figure. I'll give you another 5%. When we started looking at this problem a couple of years ago, we started thinking about what is the scale of resources that is coming to low-income countries, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, that is focused on agriculture, the work that I do. And the number that we got was less than 5% of the total resources that come into this space are foreign direct investment related. So the role of external private foreign investment is relatively modest. And what it tells us is that the role of national partners, governments, development institutions is outsized when we're looking at low-income countries as a group, or if we look at sub-Saharan Africa as a region. So it reminds us again that what we have to bring to the table is very small in comparison, and the scale and complexity of the problem is quite big. So I've been a little bit more verbose than I was hoping to, so let me come back to my brevity. When we work in this particular area, what we're trying to always do is align a community around a common goal or target. For us, we love being very specific, results-oriented, and time-bound in what we're trying to achieve. So does this community, let's say those in the room, can we have a common goal, a common outcome that we're trying to achieve? For us, this is a big problem. Secondly, is there good enough evidence in this space? What can we say? What have we already learned? You know, if you look at the Commonwealth Development Corporation that's been doing evidence in this area for 70 odd years, there's a lot of learnings that we've had, yet we're still kind of stuck in many ways where we were on many of these questions. So let us be clear about learning the lessons from the past and being clear about what the evidence tells us. Secondly, do we have better information, or a simpler word, data, on what the issues are in terms of tracking progress or monitoring how we're having impact with our partners in country? And then finally, I promised you 4. I'll just reemphasize what I probably started out with and was verbose about, and that's partners. Because we cannot achieve our big picture goals if we do not scale our work with partners in country. So that you're able to remember when we come back later, goals, being clear about one specific goal that we're trying to achieve, knowing what the evidence exists on how to achieve that, having data on how to monitor progress towards that goal, and then finally making sure that we're working across the table with as many diverse partners as possible to achieve that common goal or outcome. So I'll pause there. Thank you, Oshani.
Thank you, Ahmad. And thank you, audience. Chizuru, the Jeff is now moving into food and ag. Very exciting. The climate funds are moving into food and ag, and there is the Global Biodiversity Fund, and perhaps a few others. Could you give us a quick roundup of what the Congo Basin can expect from you from tomorrow onwards?
All right, thank you so much, Oshani and the Shamba Center, for inviting me to this this exciting dialogue. My name is Chizaoki, and I come from the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. How many of you actually know about us? Okay, like 4. All right. So, I mean, this is obviously telling that we're not doing enough outreach. So, we're here at the climate COP, right? And under this climate COP, there is what's called a financial mechanism that's been entrusted to support eligible countries, which in this case is developing countries, on their climate action as well as your obligations for the convention. So GEF is one of them, along with the Green Climate Fund and the new sister fund, the Loss and Damage Fund. That's going to be another operating entity of the financial mechanism. And so in addition to this convention, we as a GEF, we're the financial mechanism for 5 additional global agreements. One of them being the Biodiversity Convention. We also finance the Land Degradation Convention. We do Mercury, Minamata Convention, which actually has a lot of land-based actions and forestry implications. A Stockholm Convention, which is on the persistent organic pollutants, including a lot of pesticides, as well as a lot of chemicals you dump and apply to the ground. And last but not least, in New York this June, there was finally an agreement among countries on what we call it the High Seas Treaty. It's a biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions agreement. We consider the high seas to be the last frontier. All of us think that with CBD, our surface has been covered under agreement, but actually the seas beyond national jurisdictions is like no man's land, to be very honest with you. So we finally have an agreement. We, kind of like Gates Foundation, we are kind of small. We say we're kind of modest. So to serve these conventions, we have 6 funds. We've done about close to 6,000 initiatives. Our cumulative resource outlay is about $23 billion. We're not that big. considering the scale of the issue. So you had asked me to talk about agriculture as well as what we're doing for domestic resource mobilization, how to use the resources more, smartly. I manage a couple of funds for climate change adaptation. And one of the funds is for the 46 least developed countries that we have right now. Guess what is the number one subject and priority the countries come to us? It's agriculture. Then it goes to water resources management. We talk about early warning systems, so on and so forth. So in terms of ensuring that there is sustainable agricultural practices, as well as having a sustainable value chain, subsistence farming, as well as being able to address food security, from the climate change perspective, countries are already prioritizing as far as coming to us for the support, right? And then if you look at the trust fund side on the mitigation, biodiversity, land degradation, so on and so forth, one of the key sectors in the countries are also coming to us, both LDCs as well as middle income to higher income countries. Once again, the role of agriculture, the food security, as well as the whole notion of value chain for commodities and so on and so forth, very, very high on the agenda of the countries to address. So we have been in there supporting them. We have been looked at specific commodity-based value chain approaches, soy, for instance, beef, and so on and so forth. But what has come to us very vividly with the CBD's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is the whole notion of negative subsidies as well as positive subsidies. I mean, here we're talking about, what, $1.9 trillion of subsidies, negative subsidies, that's stopping a lot of the refocusing of the resources going into things that we consider to be more sustainable. And those are in the petroleum sector, energy sector, transport, but also agriculture. And if you look from the lens of biodiversity, we're talking about trying to realign, I think half a trillion dollars of resources per year. And mostly this is happening in the agricultural sector. So what can we do to make that happen in terms of making the resources being used more smartly? One thing is really looking into the whole notion of domestic resource mobilization and policy alignment. No matter how we say it, it really is not happening, right? So do we have the tools as well as mechanisms to enable countries to move in that direction? And I want to say we've done a lot of policy work and so on and so forth, supported activities, but only with the new fund for the Global Biodiversity Framework, which were established, new fund, we now have an opportunity to really help the countries to look into the whole notion of realigning, not just valuing, but realigning the policy measures and sort of rewarding countries that might want to look into the getting rid of the negative subsidies and bringing them into a more positive sphere, as well as positive subsidies to really encourage better behavior. So we're kind of excited about that. But at the end of the day, what we can mobilize is a drop in the bucket, right? So we're gonna have to look for ways to free up as well as look to realign resources domestically. And we cannot do that without having an honest conversation on the domestic resource mobilization. So I'll stop right there.
And so Chizu, what's not working? Why isn't this happening? Top 4 picks. Because
why is this not happening?
Yeah.
Because the resources that a lot of countries might have within the domestic budget are not necessarily being aligned into elements that would enable agriculture to be sustainable. I mean, that's a big one. That's basically a huge black box I think we need to start unpacking more seriously. I mean, we're talking about like close to $2 trillion annually of subsidies here, okay?
Right.
And some of that is actually in the agricultural sector. Are we doing anything about this? We're moving in that direction, but are we doing anything seriously? So,
Ahmad, trick question to you. What's not happening as you see it?
I mean, what's not happening is additional resources, period. But I think just to build on Chizuru's point, I mean, the domestic subsidy making the bad go to the good is really hard. I think in the development community, we're not very good at understanding political incentives and motivations. I see that we have parliamentarians in the room. We need to align there. How we make big things happen in country is by making sure that there's political will, ambition, that there's a domestic agenda that's being served or delivered. And that applies to both developing countries and developed countries. The $500 billion is by and large in 5 countries. I can name them, but it's probably better if I don't. But the politics domestically there are just as complicated as anywhere else. And so if we're going to achieve these big goals, we need to make sure that we understand the political incentives, and we're not good at that. I mean, and there are reasons why we don't intervene and work in that space. We do advocacy, we can't do lobbying, but there are other organizations that are doing that kind of work that complicate matters.
So now a trick question for Honorable Nima. Honorable Nima, you've heard the oldest environmental fund in the world, the GEF, and you've heard the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who is perhaps the biggest mover and shaker in Africa, give you their views on what they're doing and what's not working. What's your response?
Wow. First of all, I commend all the great work that all of you are doing. And what I can say there is possibly one of the missing links which we can also use to accelerate the different efforts is engagement of parliamentarians, and which is why my colleagues and I are setting up the African Food Systems Parliamentary Network, because oftentimes we find that such interventions, discussions are held with development partners, international organizations, government, meaning either Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Finance, but rarely is there engagement with parliamentarians. So there are times in which commitments may be made by government, but it is parliamentarians, if we are empowered enough, we are the ones who can truly hold our governments accountable. We can follow up on the different commitments made, not just by our governments, but even your organizations. If you're committing to do X, Y, Z, we can voice, is that X, Y, Z happening? But similarly, as African parliamentarians, we can work and engage with our counterparts, members of parliaments in the respective countries that you guys are operating in. So I think that can be an area that is missing, and it's my hope that from this engagement, you guys will find ways in which you can support us, because we're a group of members of parliament who are keen and committed in this area to see what can we do, but we can't do it without your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Nima. Thank you very much. But there are people who make it work, and Mohammed does. Delighted to introduce Mohammed El Damardash. You're a social entrepreneur, very impressive portfolio, and with Engasart, I have to say I'm so jealous because you're doing everything that I ever dreamed of doing in my life. I've been advising on them, but I've not been doing them, so I'm very jealous. So you're an independent power and water producer. You're betting on renewables, and your audience is small farmers. Tell us about the business model in Egypt that's making this work.
Thank you for your kind invitation. And actually, we're happy to join forces now after all these years. So my name is Mohammed El Damardash. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Engazet, and we are a private sustainable utility company. Originally, we started in 2011 in Egypt, and our business model was basically that we believe in private utility, private-to-private utility. And in the state, the world is moving from a centralized architecture to decentralized architecture when it comes to utility, and the technology's promise into that space is delivering onto the same model. So our main idea is that we finance, build, own, operate the power or water assets and sell them to a long-term off-taker that is buying power, and we are the first company to introduce water to the game. When we had tapped this to the industry, to the commercial applications, things were much easier. But when we started going to agriculture sector, the idea was much tougher to implement. Our flagship project was in 2019. That was a $10 million investment in El Wadi Al Jadid, Al Dakhla. That's actually an oasis in Egypt in the Western Desert. And just before to go to the project, I just want to give an idea about the landscape in which this project was done. Egypt has been doing agriculture for thousands of years. One of the most ancient agro-economies in the world. And for so long, Egypt was delivering everything literally for free. I mean, the river Nile is flowing, the sun is glowing, and everything is amazing. But 10 years ago, the whole ball game had changed in Egypt because the government had reached the debt ceiling and there's no more capacity to subsidize fossil fuel. Agriculture, I mean, 5% of the land in the valley and the delta, and that's actually the inhabitants of more than 100 million people. 95% of the land is off-grid. And suddenly, I mean, what's happening in the world, the wars and stuff, so 30% of the wheat production and the wheat consumption in Egypt is from Ukraine and Russia. The food bill had given a really risen high and the foreign reserves is low. So that is kind of a chaotic scene that's very tough. The food bill is high, the power bill is high, the dollar is few, and the land is not available. So we have to go to the desert. We have to localize our agriculture. And agriculture makes 80% of the water consumption, which is in Egypt, it's very high, it's highly scarce. We are less than 500 meter cube per capita. So we need to double the footprint, put more water where there's no water and there's no energy. So it's a by design food-water nexus issue. So the idea was simple. I mean, we've been always talking to multilateral institutions, the developmental funds, and everybody. Everybody was trying to bombard the farmers to, I mean, we need to educate them on technology, we need to educate them on how to do things, we need to do that, and we need to reinvent. They have to be tech savvies and investment banking savvies, and also the marketeers to be able to do their farming. And that's, for us, was not a proper venue. And we believe that, and we started from a very basic assumption that utility is a business and agriculture is another. And utility is 50% of the agro production costs. So when we started, when everything was subsidized, solar, efficient water treatment was just an environmental narrative where nothing made sense to them. But with this kind of challenge Egypt is facing now, and I believe whole Africa is facing now, is the environmental narrative, the sustainability narrative is now an economical narrative. It makes a lot of sense that we need to go with a decarbonized, we bring the power from the sun, which is very cheap than the fossil fuel, and we need to consume water less because we don't have it, okay? So the business model was as follows, is that we own and operate and finance the asset, and with this surrounding community of farmers, we deliver the water and power on pay-as-you-go basis. To de-risk this, we had to, I mean, most of the very fragile farmers, we had to use two things mainly to de-risk this into the investment we've made. One is through contractual farming. So it's not enough to give the farmer the power and the water, but also the offtake contract that is able to sell his produce once done. So this offtake contract for us was a good collateral to deliver on the utility investment at the back end of the value chain. And the second thing is that we integrated lots of technology and engineering decisions to arrive at the highest efficiency of power and levelized cost of water with a digital edge that is able to maintain our traceability for the utility sold that is being billable at the time where the farmer has the cash flow necessary for that when he actually sell his produce at the moment of the harvest. So with this combination, I mean, contractual farming, the digital promise and the sustainability promise of clean technology, I guess we've arrived into a formula that's engineered end-to-end all over the value chain from power to water to agriculture in a way that made sense to investment, something that had taken our portfolio to more than $17 million of investment right now. 40% is FDI, despite the devaluation, despite the high risk availability of that, but it's actually promising of very good returns. And at the same time, tackling all the right SDG goals, meaning decarbonized agriculture, which is basically the definition of sustainable agriculture, is decarbonized agriculture and very efficient water footprint. That's the definition of that we simply put in our formula to deliver on the major overarching theme of our activities as Ingazet is the eradication of poverty through the access to clean energy and water. So it's delivering onto 90% of the food production is on the shoulders of smallholder farmers in Egypt. 80% of the water is in agro-space, so it's water scarcity issue, food security problem, and of course, partnership for the goals and all the other SDG goals that's included in the formula. So with that, it's working, and I guess there is a lot to be done into that space, and most importantly, and we were talking about that a few days ago, that the efficiency of taking this to scale in Egypt and to whole Africa, which is a core of our communication with most of the impact investment funds and the multilateral institutions and so on, is how efficient we talk to each other, how efficient we sit, because the formula is working now. It's driving the investment, and most of the projects, 50%, 60% now is operational. So it is working and it's on the ground, but it's how to, it is a different ball game when they take this to a bigger scale. It's a different ball game when we take to different cross borders with different kind of mitigations that needs to be done in different markets and be customized to different markets. We know the markets of Egypt very well, but to go to Congo, to go to Congo Basin, we need to sit with people who are there, who knows the problems, who are actually understanding the landscape, and start customizing what we've been doing to the next level. So yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Chizu, for remembering the claps. Mohammed, what are the incentives that you find useful, that you found useful when setting up this business model?
Okay, I would say that, when we arrive at this stage, it looks rosy and nice, but the failures were so much bigger than the achievements, and the failures taught us a lot along the way. First of all, we had lots of bets onto many other architecture, many other styles of doing things, but I guess what worked best is that we need to embrace the current situation rather than reinventing its wheel, meaning that there is an issue of knowledge transfer, there is an issue of lots of fundamental hinders and challenges, but actually the most important idea that came to our mind to untap this business model is that we think we know better than smallholder farmers. But maybe if we reverse this and think that maybe they know better than us, maybe all what we need to do is to serve them rather than educate them to be us, So, maybe they are better in what they do, much better than what we do, and that we need to give them the very promise of nature, but in a technologically advanced way. So maybe that was a transitional thought, that we need to adapt to the current situation and challenges. Second thing is that it has to be commercially viable. It has to be investable. It has to be bankable. And the bank is a Bible, and the money has a Bible, and we need to commit to that and find the way that makes it work, rather than trying to convince investment banking with returns that's very low or philanthropic activities that might work in some cases, but will never fly for the rest. We had to talk to the farmers and talk in the economical narrative, because you cannot convince a farmer to go be good to the environment when he's not able to sustain his living. So the idea is, let's help them make their living and make them resilient to the change rather than doing anything else. So I guess the most important resource that we believe had worked best to answer your question is how good we communicate to each other to make this work.
Thank you, Mohammed. In that spirit of communication, I'm going to ask the audience a quick question. Insurance. Very important to de-risk farming and improve the credit profile of small farmers, right? Yeah, the gentleman at the back is nodding. That's great. Sir, could you tell me, in Africa, in how many countries do you think farmers have insurance? Take a guess. Guess. Mr. Lusuba, you're taking a guess. Trick question.
Many trick questions today. I honestly do not know, but I would venture no more than 10% of countries, no more than 5 or 6 countries would have such mechanisms in place.
54 countries, 4 have access to insurance. And keep the mic, Mr. Lusuba. Out of those 4 countries, and you look at the entirety of smallholders, what is the percentage of them that has access to insurance?
Out of these 4 countries?
Yes. Average across the 4 countries. Percentage of farmers with access to insurance currently having contracts.
I think it's probably going to be very low. No more than maybe 20, 30% at most. 4%.
4%. 4%. So that's the reality of the market. And Jean Mundy, you're from the One Acre Fund. If I may say, it's one of the most innovative structures that we've seen to date, so congratulations. Your work is pioneering. We are even more excited because you announced One Acre Re a couple of days ago, a reinsurance program for smallholders. Tell us about it.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Je suis désolé, je ne parle pas français, mais je comprends un petit peu. Merci beaucoup. So yeah, my name is John Mundy. I'm from One Acre Fund. I'm the Director of Global Partnerships. We operate in 9 countries in Africa. And One Acre Fund started with a very simple idea in 2006 with 6 farmers in Rwanda and 64 farmers in Kenya, which is if you serve farmers with a package of inputs close to where they live and delivered on time and financed, that they can grow bigger harvests and have healthier soils. It sounds simple. It's pretty hard to do in practice. But today we now serve 4 million farmers in those 9 countries. About 1.6 million are financed directly, and then 2.4 million are receiving tree seedlings. So we're the largest tree planting organization in Africa with farmers now. And also we have thousands of retail outlets. So we also do inputs on cash. So we've grown to be a platform serving farmers with many different products and services, speaking to the business case. But our core package, our core model, and to get into the insurance, is to finance farmers in kind with a package of inputs that they choose and enroll in every year. We're not a non-profit. We are a non-profit social enterprise. So we still earn revenue. We're still rather like a large MFI. And we found that to de-risk that investment, we absolutely had to make sure insurance was part of the package of inputs that we were financing. For our impact evaluations, we already collect about 20,000 crop cuts a year. So we know within a 10-kilometer radius what the yields were of more or less every farmer of our program. So we do area yield-based insurance products because we already have the data on maize yields predominantly to be able to understand what the yields were in any given area, match that with weather data, and insure the product. Most of the discussion in insurance is usually about should farmers pay for insurance or shouldn't they pay? Should they elect a product that doesn't seem very valuable unless they have a disaster? And why would you spend money on insurance if you don't know you're going to get it back? You know, it's a tough sell. Insurance is a really tough sell. So we actually don't ask any farmer to make that choice. All insurance is wrapped around the credit offering that we have. And so they don't even know it exists unless they have a catastrophic event and then they get their loan returned to them, their cash deposit returned, or their inputs returned to them for the next planting season. So they're never at risk of default. We basically only insure credit. This isn't good enough, though, in insurance. because we know that farmers are losing far more than just the bag of seed or fertilizer that they have on credit. If they have a catastrophic event on farm, their entire harvest is wiped out, and much of that harvest is invested in cash. It's not that they're taking all of their credit out with us. We also know that most farmers are experiencing economic shocks that are far more disastrous for them than your average flood or drought at a national level. So somewhere like Malawi, where we cover the entire southern part of Malawi, or Rwanda, where we cover the whole country, most of the issues that farmers are facing are often economic shocks. So for example, in Malawi, 70% of our clients are women, and those women are often struggling to get to healthcare facilities when they give birth. But all healthcare coverage is covered in Malawi, and there is a decent agriculture insurance system. But we're finding the transport cost is too expensive for them to get to hospital. And then they often don't survive that experience tragically, and therefore the farm is lost. I'm just giving this example because in the insurance market, we've never had the flexibility before to design our own microinsurance products. So we have now launched this fund to be able to do microinsurance for the first time, which means funeral care, health care, other products and services required across different countries. And we're also designing this fund to be able to do crop loss insurance for whole farm products, and not just backing our input credit package. That does mean that we're going to subsidize insurance. And we see this as critical because only 1% of African agricultural insurance is insured within the very small percentages that you mentioned. And guess what? In America, about 100% of agriculture is insured to some extent by the Farm Bill. And we think it's absolutely critical for insurance to be subsidized. But actually, there aren't many mechanisms to subsidize. So if you put it in a fund, where do you put it? And that's partly why the IFC, DFC, and many of our partners are backing One Acre Fund Re, is to capitalize a fund that will allow guarantee structures that will sit within the Africa Risk Capacity Network. So we have regulated coverage. And we'll also make it open source. So the new products and services that we design, anyone in Africa can deploy these products. So we're addressing coverage products. We're addressing accessibility. We're addressing cost of the premiums, which is a major issue. And we're actually addressing the capital structures. I could go into depth about the capital structure of the insurance markets, but that is probably one of the most boring things I could talk about. So I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much, John. We are going to come back to you, but I'm going to ask Rachel to give us the underline. Well, now we've all talked about the flows of money, and we haven't really discussed why they're not being absorbed. And this is where you're going to come in and tell us why and how is ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance, the buzzword that we hear in blended financing, in private financing, in domestic financing. This is the buzzword we are hearing. Why is it more than a buzzword? Why is it essential to make domestic markets robust enough to absorb currency?
Thank you. I'd like to warmly thank all the organizers today for inviting me. My name is Rachel Aron. I serve as the Managing Director of Tugo Chwini Management Consulting. We focus on ESG and sustainability services. Now, I would like to maybe start by explaining what is ESG, because everybody's heard it, but it's sometimes not understood quite well to give the context. So ESG stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. However, it talks about and references how either a company, an organization, or a country understands the impact of its programs, policies, or activities on the environment and natural resources, on people and local communities, and also with respect to transparency and accountability. That's at a very broad level. Now, ESG can serve two key purposes.
which I think are key for the discussion we're talking about today. Obviously, we're here in the midst of the pavilion of the Congo Basin Climate Commission and several countries that are part of it, but also more broadly to Africa. So ESG can serve as a framework to look as in terms of risk management, to understand what are the environmental, social, and governance risks that exist, especially at a domestic level. And when we talk a domestic level, it can be at a local level, because we operate a lot of times the local level, the level of either villages or municipalities. It can be at a regional level, depending on how we're structured. It can also be a broader national level. So I bring in those three thresholds because ESG can vary. Secondly, it can also serve as a framework in which to leverage new opportunities for improvement, including new opportunities to be able to mobilize domestic financing and to be able to not only mobilize it, ensure that you actually obtain it, because that's another issue we'll discuss. It's actually dispersed, it's implemented, it's monitored and reported on, and it's used effectively. Now, ESG is key, because what is ESG? A lot of times it's looked as, oh, ESG comes from outside, you need it because multilateral or bilateral development institutions require it. Yes, they do. But ESG is about how do you want your society to look like? How do you want to protect your environment and the resources, what we call natural capital? In Africa, we have a lot of resources that form part of our green economy and our blue economy. The blue economy being everything in our rivers and our seas and all. And you've heard all these buzzwords, but basically these contribute to our economies and our growth. But if we don't understand where ESG sits within the blue economy, green economy, at a national level, even at a sectoral level, because there are differences, then you don't understand how to utilize the benefits or the potential of ESG to mobilize domestic resourcing. So when it comes to agriculture, when we're talking about ESG, what are the issues we're talking about? Yes, climate change is a big buzzword. I'm not going to take away from that because it's COP28. However, climate change is not the only ESG issue that we're faced with in Africa. We're talking about biodiversity. We're talking about cultural heritage. We're talking about other issues around gender that are really key to understand. So if you don't understand within agriculture or fisheries, what is ESG, the bigger framework, what are the ESG issues, how to address them, then you don't know how to orient the financing that you're looking for. Because we mobilize financing to address economic, social, or environmental problems. That's what we seek to do. So you also have to look at, for instance, if we take pension funds, all of our countries have pension funds across Africa and outside. And the pension funds are, yes, they're there as pensions, but they also have a commercial role. They're also meant to make money so they're sustainable over time. A number of pension funds in our countries make investments, real estate, infrastructure, manufacturing. But what guides that investment? There are ESG criteria that can be built in so that the pension funds are used in a manner in which they promote sustainability. What does that actually mean concretely? You can have projects, for instance, agricultural technologies. You can have entrepreneurs. You can have new innovations. You can also have another area that we often don't talk about, intellectual property rights, which take a lot of money. And people, you can have a great idea, but if you can't protect that, it no longer becomes an asset of your country. The copyright is registered outside of Africa, and we lose it. And we've lost a lot of copyright, a lot of ideas, because there hasn't been sufficient domestic financing or legal support to do it. So the reason I talk at a broad level of ESG is a mechanism that you can introduce into your pension funds to guide, let's do and get involved in impact investing across the country in different regions. But you define, these are the sectors we're going to look, or the subsectors. Then we look at what are the cross-sectoral linkages. When it comes to agriculture and food, we're looking at cross-sectoral linkages with the tourism sector, the transport sector, other sectors that make it much more viable in the ecosystem. So then you look to see who are the domestic investors who traditionally, or not traditionally, might have an interest. So you have investors, we have a lot of businessmen and businesswomen. They're doing it privately. If you put together, use ESG as a framework, we're getting into impact investment that focuses on the value chain. We hear this word a lot of times. The value chain does not just mean agricultural transformation. The value chain also means logistics. The value chain also means digital systems and e-commerce. The value chain also means how do we then develop not only entrepreneurs, we need people who are scientists and researchers and everything, because we're also dealing in a world where climate change is impacting us. So we need seeds and other inputs that are much more climate resilient. We can't plant the same seeds we always planted because they don't work. Our seasonal patterns are changing rapidly. Once upon a time, we had maybe one rainy season. We're now having two. Once upon a time, we had no droughts. We're having droughts or extreme heat. So the ESG allows you to look at how do we take the information, analyze it, address it, package it in a way that we look at investments and drive in an impact investment and mobilize venture capitalists. We mobilize a number of tech investors or tech companies, mobilize startups. Now I want to end maybe on saying, I know we're going to talk about this even further. We often look at a national level and assume, let's say for instance, I'm from Uganda, so only Ugandans are interested in investing in Uganda. So we focus on just that in terms of domestic mobilization. However, we have a lot of Africans from the diaspora within our countries. There's nothing that stops us at a national level from bringing together, whether it's Uganda, Ugandans, people from the broader EAC, East Africa community, or other regions to support the development of Uganda, support the development in Congo, the Republic of Congo, or other countries. So we also have to look at the lens. ESG, we have the power of regionalism. We're over 1.4 billion people in Africa and some of our regions. There's nothing that stops us from using ESG to mobilize, to focus and orient, to leverage new opportunities, to pool money together, and where it's not possible to get finances, technical financial resources, you have also technical resources. You need to make use of ESG experts or people who work in the field who can guide you. And lastly, let me end by saying there are a number of pension funds that exist in Asia and North America, and they're very interested in getting involved in Africa and financing, but they have a criteria. And they often have ESG criteria that's linked to their legislation. So it's not that they sit and decide, we're just going to put this criteria as a barrier. Their legislation, their countries, has sustainability or ESG-oriented criteria to be able to better manage risk. Now, what is missing from our side within Africa? We have pension funds and others, but we lack the ESG criteria. That sometimes is a missing link, and it's not difficult. Work to put that criteria in place that's tailored to our countries, our sectors, our national development priorities, so that we can, as domestic financing, collaborate and co-create synergies that are meaningful and are win-win with where there's external financing outside, for instance, with pension funds. Thank you.
Chizuru, do you have to leave early? Before you go, listening to Rachel and the importance of the ESG criteria moving in to domestic policies and laws, what would be the very important biodiversity criteria for the Congo Basin that could be in law to make best use of the global biodiversity framework?
I couldn't even begin to answer that question, but to basically indicate that within the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there are elements, targets that are specifically targeted towards the mobilization of resources, right?
Right.
And there are elements that are related to the conservation of specific ecosystems, those target setting. And I think there is a need for us to much better understand what those might be at the country level and how one would need to go about developing a financing plan, if you will, at the country level, each and every country, on how you go about mobilizing resources to meet the targets that will be set about, that have been set up in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And the elements she has highlighted obviously are very important. But can I just also touch upon one thing?
Yes,
that
of course.
Honorable
Nima.
Nima highlighted a very important issue, I think, that we tend not to really put enough emphasis on, which is at the end of the day, when we're talking about, when I talked about domestic resource mobilization as well as decision making, it's not necessarily the policy setup per se. I think there's an entire process within the country that will get to the point of legislation as well as the political debate that would need to take place. And we tend not to put enough of an emphasis on how to actually work with the legislature as well as policymakers in this particular arena. And I think she brought up a very important point. And as a matter of fact, I think we have been trying to see if there's any interest, if you will, on the partnership related to, I don't know if you're familiar, you must be familiar with International Conservation Caucus type initiatives that we have been working with to make sure there is a network of policy
No, we are not. We would need to become familiar.
So different countries would have, conservation caucuses as well as other mechanisms to enable them to definitely try to align interests in a way within the country that's more positive towards the conservation as well as sustainability outcomes. And I do think that's an element that we have been trying to highlight more, and I think we can do a lot more. I'm sorry that probably wasn't the answer that you were looking for, but I just wanted to put that on the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Chizu. Yes, John, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond briefly because I was hosting some investors in Zambia recently, and they were ESG consultants. And it was for a carbon project, because I also manage carbon finance, another big opportunity area. And this is a good story and a bad story, and I'm going to focus on the bad briefly, but I'll get to the good part. The bad bit was the language used for ESG investors. These investors were from the Netherlands. The language was very foreign to our operations, and I could imagine that might be the same in many other investment opportunities in Africa. Also, the amount of data required. And I think when we talk about ESG, we're talking about data, basically. And insurance is data. Impact and M&E is data. It's all data, right? ESG is data. So the requests were onerous on the amount of data that we had to collect. But the investors weren't willing to pay for it. And I think this is the key message for me on the investment opportunity and the challenge. The carbon price in the carbon markets is not high enough to warrant us collecting all of the ESG required. The insetting from Mars and Mondelez and Cargill is not coming from with a premium commodity price. And I think to drive the markets towards that direction, also in the insurance market, a lot of the insurance premiums at the moment are too high because insurance brokers don't have the actual data needed to appropriately price the risk on the African continent. The risk is actually a lot lower in Africa than people realize because they don't have the data. And the value is a lot higher, but they don't want to look at the data because it means they're going to have to pay more. And that is a key challenge we're facing at the moment.
Yes.
Just want to clarify, because this is a complex topic, so there's no misunderstanding. The data that's being referred to, so the European Union, as of next year, has legislation that becomes mandatory that includes a lot of data. So European companies that are operating within Europe and also outside are now required by European law to report on a lot of data sets. It's almost hundreds of data sets in some areas. It's a lot, it's excessive. So those operating even in the African countries will be required to look at this data. So in that sense, there is a gap because most countries are not even aware that this is coming. So that's part of the data that's being referred to. However, I want to qualify, ESG is not about just data. Data is but one component of ESG, and that one component of ESG needs to be understood. ESG goes above and beyond data. Now, this comes down to what is negotiated. I know because my previous capacity, I worked for the African Development Bank for a number of years. So we used to drive what goes into some of those agreements and what isn't. So when I'm dealing with certain countries, even up to now, and consulting now, I make sure certain things I know that are impractical or are not achievable are not put in there, because that's going to be an immediate block to even getting the money. So it's also, if you have the understanding on ESG, what do you negotiate with those investors? It's about, number one, mapping the investors you want to go to. Some investors may not be right from an ESG perspective for your country or for your projects right now, depending on where you are. Some others might be much more flexible. The mapping needs to be understood. In the same way you don't take money from all banks, you take the money from the banks that are suitable to your needs. The same approach has to be applied to investors. Secondly, there are investors or others, or organizations or others, who are willing to provide what we call technical assistance, because we know there is a gap, so that the costs are not incurred at the level of a country or national institutions, because they just don't have the capacity. And you're asking for maybe requirements that go above and beyond national requirements. So there is also funding that works to build capacity on ESG and technical assistance to get to that level. What is important is, what do you want to do? How can ESG help you? And how do you tailor and negotiate those ESG terms so that you use it to leverage or help orient the financing, but you don't do it in a way that's detrimental to you? So that is extremely important. And the reporting, you can take an adaptive approach. This is where we want to be. This is where we are. This is how we'll gradually get there. You also don't want to be overburdened, where you have a lot of investors with so many different requirements you're reporting to on a quarterly basis, and that's all you do. You can't get down to doing the work because you're consumed by that. And I'm talking about investors. Even the PE funds have LPs who've invested in them who have their own requirements. So sometimes the requirements are coming from the fund level to your level, down to the project level, on down to those are the portfolio companies. It becomes overwhelming. It becomes literally overwhelming. What you have to look for is how to synchronize that reporting. What are the key things I need to go? And to ensure you're not just focusing on quantitative ESG-related data, but also qualitative. Because at the end of the day, we're emerging economies across Africa. We have high unemployment rates. We're trying to bring in women and men into the labor markets, both formal and informal. So if all you're doing is you're consumed by investors who have high demands on reporting and data, you're not really getting down to the impact of what you want to do. So I just thought I would emphasize that, because a lot of times it's assumed that investor puts these conditions and they're mandatory and there's nothing you can do. It's not true. You need people who are able to understand the issue, just on legal, tax, and other areas, negotiate on terms that make sense, seek support where you need to, and then find other ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And what you're saying is equally true in negotiating with the development finance institutions, right? It's not just private investors that you... It is particularly important with the development finance institutions too.
Yes, and you can find allies. You will find maybe a number of us are now in different capacities, but we've worked for those development institutions. We know how they operate. That's not a secret. We know where the red flags, yellow flags are. That's not an issue. At the same time, you also have to understand the investors want to come into your country the same way you have domestic investors who want to expand their reach across different sectors. So you have the power, the potential, and the leverage. You are standing at the gates to determine what type of domestic investment, and which is why the engagement with parliamentarians is key. You guide the type of legislation that makes a country have the enabling environment that's required. You can say, okay, we're going to focus on these priority sectors and put legislation with an ESG or sustainability focus, introduce the carbon credit markets. Gabon is an example in the region, in Central Africa. That's an amazing approach in terms of carbon credits through their forests, and has made millions of dollars that they're able to use for development purposes. So it could be you may not have a certain model, but some of your neighbors or elsewhere do. But you have to understand, how did they do it? It's not a secret to figure out. At the same time, I'd also caution about the type of advice that you get. The different advice that's given, because it's become a business. It's become a business, and it's become a business where our governments are over overbilled is the honest truth for advice. It's become a business, this white paper, this policy, and it leads to nothing. It's also important when you have those vital resources, understanding who you contract with to ensure you get the advice that you can actually implement and to help you mobilize the domestic resourcing or use it in other ways. And I say this because I understand the field. We've seen people do it. We've had to come in and stop them. We know who they are. So it's also be careful about who it is. And we don't also have to go outside Africa. This is not an offensive comment. We have a great talent in terms of advisors who are African within our countries and across our regions. See where you can get that talent and all, so it can help you in structuring the sustainably focused domestic financing that you desire to be able to put the models that would get you the type of results in the short, medium, and long term.
Fabulous, Rachel. Questions from the floor, starting with Honorable Nima.
It's not really a question. It's just a reaction on the EU Data Act. In fact, from what I know, because it's an area that I work on, the EU Data Act and the EU AI Act, both of them, I think the AI Act is also going to pass, so it's due to be passed early next year. They don't necessarily mean that companies that will be registered in EU have to behave in the same way when they operate in African countries. And that is one of the gaps that as African MPs we're trying to voice, that there should be a global minimum acceptable behavior, because at the moment, the companies that are dealing with data, the companies that are dealing with AI, they'll have the perfect behavior as per law when operating within the EU. But when they come to operate in countries where we don't have the same level of legislation, number one, or number two, we're poorer. You know, some of these companies, their annual revenue is more than our GDPs. So even our commanding status is not the same. They behave in a total opposite way. And the EU Act or whatever acts in their respective countries don't comply. So I just wanted to clarify that part, because it's an area that I'm actually working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable. Do you want to respond, Rachel? Yeah? And John, would you want to respond to that?
Oh, well, I'm sure Rachel can respond. I think Rachel was referring to the Deforestation Act.
Yes. Yes.
Which mandates that all companies have to report deforestation from their supply chain in Africa as well. However, I did work on tech and data in East Africa before, and that is a key issue where most these companies don't have data centers or data investments within Africa. And I think what you're saying is an absolutely key, critical issue on data sharing and data rules. I don't know if you wish to.
Yes. No, it's all of that. No. I think what might be useful is maybe we should find a mechanism to share all the different EU legislations that are coming into effect next year, so that within your parliamentary groups, you can be aware of them and then know what the implications are. That way, as you mobilize within your different caucuses, you know what the pressure is, what's expected, what's not going to be done. I think maybe that can be a first starting point. And then you can put the political pressures as necessary, those arguments, so that there's a understanding in Tanzania and Congo, this is what we expect of you as countries. And see also your legislative bodies or regulatory bodies, who, let's say NEMAs in East Africa, National Environmental Management Authorities and equivalents, are they aware of what's coming fully? What are some of the contradictions, conflicts, and where you have the mechanisms to have penalties? You have penalty mechanisms against violators. Some countries we've seen have been revising that, so they're increasing the fines, environmental penalties, or some of the countries have environmental tribunals where they take companies, both domestic and foreign too, when they've broken the law. So maybe we can start as that to inform you of what they are, and then we can continue that dialogue.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Yes? We have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists for really a riveting conversation, really enlightening and inspiring in many ways. So I'd like to ask a question of each of you. So if you will bear with me, because each of you said things that I believe require more digging to enlighten us further. So let me begin with Ahmad. Ahmad, you talked about impact and the multiplier effect. You suggested that even the mighty BMGF has limited resources relative to the magnitude of the problem. So specifically, what have you found are those interventions, those areas of focus that are most promising in terms of delivering that multiplier effect? So that is question number one. Question number two is directed at Mohammed. So, fantastic business model. And you said something which reminded me of a very important idea that was reiterated in a conference I was at recently, which is that we should not look at smallholder farmers as beneficiaries, but as clients, as business people, and treat them as such. And I think that speaks to a lot of what has been said about, yes, we can look at enabling environment in terms of shaping the environment to satisfy those needs, but we also need to adapt to that environment and learn from that environment. So I very much appreciated that. I was just curious about the financing model of your business. Is this something that requires significant investments? Is this something, I'm sure it can be scaled up, but can it be scaled down to address smaller communities and smaller groups of farmers? For your business specifically, how many farmers are involved in your system? Because again, I think it's a fantastic system, and I very much appreciate the fact that you focus on the commercialization aspect. I think that is often a missing link. We tend to look a lot at productivity, less at helping farmers commercialize. And so I would love to know more about your model in this sense. And in a way, my question to John is similar in the sense, what is the financing model for the Green Acre, the 1 Acre Fund, sorry? How, to put it bluntly, how much do you need to cover this, to subsidize these micro-insurance policies for all these farmers? Can you give us an order of magnitude to get a sense of what we're talking about? How much would, say, Congo need to mobilize in order to provide insurance for 100, 200,000 farmers? And finally, Rachel, you spoke of ESG, and there was, I'm not sure if it was John or if it was Rachel who mentioned the way that ESG standards can sometimes be lost in translation. How do you see, and what is your experience of the role of legislation, regulation in this respect? What advice would you have for a parliamentarian who's considering what legislative interventions and what laws can be drafted that can inscribe ESG standards and incentivize businesses, incentivize even the government to adopt this language and those standards? So these are my questions. Again, thank you all for riveting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I start with Ahmad. Yes.
Yeah, having Ahmad as your first name doesn't bode well for school memories. Always called first. For us, probably the best work on identifying what works well is work that colleagues at Shamba Center have done. A few years ago, they published a focus collection in the journal Nature, so the highest possible scientific standard, that identified roughly 10 areas where we, and let's say the evidence suggests, everyone should invest. And that's aligned towards one common goal or outcome. That's doubling small-scale producer productivity, their income, and doing so in a way that does not exceed the Paris Accord greenhouse gas emission targets. To just take one example and give you a benefit cost ratio, one specific area that focus collection tells us to invest in is rural advisory and extension services. The benefit cost ratio for that is 34:1 when you're looking at sub-Saharan Africa as a region. So very, very high ROI. The outcome from this publication and the work that the colleagues at Shamba Center did was to get us to invest more in that specific area. So we responded and learned from the evidence. We're continuing this work. And we're now beginning to dig in deeper into the climate question. What early evidence from this area tells us, say in terms of what are good bets, weather and data services. Benefit cost ratio of roughly 101:1 from the early assessments that we've gotten from the Innovation Commission, again, also partners of colleagues at the Shamba Center. So what we have to do at the foundation is, again, being modest about the scale of our resources in comparison to the problem, is figure out what are the one or two specific levers that we are capable of pulling as a philanthropy that is far away from the subcontinent, and then that has impact. And so that's how we come to, and that's how we dig into these benefit cost ratios and these intervention sets. But one simple message to leave you with, the academic literature in agriculture is almost conclusive over the last 70 years about the need and returns on investment in research and innovation. That is almost categorical, however you cut it. And it is by far underinvested in when we come to the subcontinent.
Back to your question. Thank you for your words. But the idea from our business model was basically that if the end user or the business beneficiary of the power or the water utility is the smallholder farmer, that does not mean that the utility has to be small. So the idea was to deliver economies of scale, the value of economies of scale to smallholder farmers. Okay, and the idea here is that through utility, through sustainable utility, now it doesn't take you much to convince the smallholder farmer that if you do a solar power plant is much better than you do a diesel generator because the economics say so. It's not difficult now to convince him that when you used to talk of a deep water well that he drills down the ground, that he consumes all of it in pumping and dry out because everything was subsidized, even the dollar was devalued, was not in its real value. Now with this capex going up, it's not very tough of a sell to tell him that you only need to operate it for 6, 7, 8 hours so that it keeps the well to regenerate and according to the standards and according to ESG norms of the world. So the argument is making sense. So the whole idea is that we need to, with the power of the sustainable utility, it gives us the capacity for good governance of agriculture. Because this is the source that they build the agro-produce. And also, it all depends. Wherever we go, in a country like Egypt, there is, I mean, even if you go to high rich water countries like Sudan, go anywhere and where, even the Congo Basin, I mean, wherever you go, even in rich areas of water, there is always a power and water problem. The idea is, what is the water problem? It is either scarcity, it's treatment, desalination, it's distribution, okay? It's the water is there, but it needs to go to there, okay? It's purification. There's always something to be done about water. So the power of the utility had driven into the design of the utility itself, and the design takes us to the levelized cost of water. And with the levelized cost of water, it has to be aligned to what should be produced to be able to indemnify or rectify this kind of investment. And we were discussing this a couple of days ago in the other session, that the world has been going on to a paradoxical argument, whether it's agriculture versus forestation, for instance. This kind of fight has been going on forever. But the fact is, and practicality is that it can always work together. It is not at all paradoxical. And it's a clear example in any kind of agro-development that we do in the desert, it will have to imply some sort of forestation for windbreakers. Okay, and it has to include an integrated farming mechanism that delivers on trees versus crops. And that is by design, and that's actually real life examples. The moment we go to the site, it was all desert. The moment we're out of the site, it's full of biodiversity, different creatures going everywhere, and it can actually work. So the utility is not only delivering on what is the inputs of production, but it also delivering on the governance of the agro process, the feasibility of the agro process, and that's how it's all integrated, power to water to agriculture.
So your question about the sustainability of insurance in our economic model, I'll try and do this in 30 seconds. So we're at 73% farmer revenue generated, 27% philanthropy focused. So we are not a commercially developed business yet. We might be in the future, but many decades in the future. Insurance is an incredibly cost-effective way of de-risking your operations. It's about 5 to 7% of our total working capital is the premium that we pay. We're the lowest premium on the continent because we bundle all 9 countries into one portfolio, and we're able to get very low premium rates. So the way to make it affordable, to make the business case in agriculture work is you have to bundle services. To make insurance financially viable, you have to bundle many, many insurance products and the entire portfolio together. But for your information, I think the risk sharing for loss and damage paper, scaling up protection for the Global South from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership has just shown that governments can subsidize insurance at $5 to $10 million per year, and from the Global North's investment in loss and damage funds to generate about $700 to $1 billion worth of protection per country to protect over 10% of your GDP from climate shocks. So there's a lot of evidence out there now that subsidized insurance is an incredibly efficient way to protect whole governments from climate risks and disasters. And I can talk to you more afterwards about that paper.
Thank you. The question you asked is extremely important. And I would say this. First, it starts with the sensitization of legislators. They need that sensitization of what is ESG in general and what is ESG specifically for the Congo, or what should it mean? Because I think that's key. Now, secondly, it's looking at what approach you want to take as parliamentarians. If you want to take a targeted institutional approach, for instance, your central bank, which is key, you can think about legislation or working with the central bank, because I know some of it's legislation, some of it is not, your efforts, in terms of embedding sustainability principles. There's some key markets or some key countries, Nigeria, Kenya, and others, that in which a central bank has developed and adopts sustainability principles. And given the power of it, it's filtered down. There's also your stock exchange. And in terms of introducing sustainability criteria requirements that would apply to listed companies, both domestic and international that operate in the Congo. So that's institutional targeted legislation. You can look at, see at a national level, do you want to do certain things? For instance, having a national green growth strategy, national circular economy plan, other things also around, we didn't get to talk about it today, but gender and climate change linkages. It's an area I worked on for a number of years. So there's a lot of money in gender funds, a lot of money in climate funds. However, there's the new dawn that's finally being accepted, where in the past few months, including this month, the setting up of and the establishment of gender-focused climate funds and vice versa, meaning gender-responsive climate investments. So you might want to look as a country, this has been done through the International Union, the Conservation of Nature, putting together at national level what's known as climate change gender action plans, which orient the country in terms of gender and climate change to major issues all of our countries are facing, going through the exercise, the whole process we can talk about afterwards, but through it to basically target investors and institutions specifically that'll be willing to provide financing in this realm. So I say all this very broadly. It depends on what your intention is and what you want to target, but they're different mechanisms. I will say this, political will is extremely important. This is an area where we need parliamentarians to lead because you bring everybody together. Ministers are fine, but ministers come and go and everything. So do directors of certain government entities and all state-owned enterprises. To ensure continuity, the legislative framework and support that you bring to either put up national regulations, legislations, sector-focused ones. So another area you can do is decide on what are the 3 or 5 priority sectors for the Congo that you want to focus on sustainability and basically embed different sustainability ESG aspects, mechanisms, the different tools, and focus that in terms of your investment resource mobilization efforts. Lastly, I wouldn't be fair if I didn't talk about the financial sector, especially commercial banks. Our commercial banks have a lot of power, but our commercial banks often fail to look at how to make the most of lines of credits. They can open up lines of credits that target youth entrepreneurs or other mechanisms, women entrepreneurs, green lines of credit, blue lines of credits, all sorts of things. In some countries, what they've done is given incentives, or I don't want to say penalties, but disincentives, if you as a banking entity do not look at ways for integrating those who might be marginalized or who are excluded. So it goes beyond financial inclusion, but in bringing together financial included ESG, so that financial products are developed that might be sustainability focused, but the benefit targets are entrepreneurs of certain categories and classes in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to hand over to Honorable German Suba to close this event. We are sharp on time, 5 minutes. Mr. Suba, the podium's yours.
Thank you, Oshani, once more. Thank you to all of the panelists for this really eye-opening and thought-provoking conversation. I realized that I failed the numerical portion of this test, but hopefully I can give a decent restitution of what's been said today. So, I believe that at the heart of what has been discussed today is the fact that solutions actually exist. There are many opportunities for impact, many opportunities to take what little resources we have and generate multiplier knock-on effects. We need to be conscious in order to realize that impact that we seek. We need to be conscious of a lot of things. Conscious of the fact that not everybody has the same level of understanding of what is possible. This goes in line with building those partnerships that you discussed, Ahmad. Building partnerships, working, I think you mentioned learning from data and experience. It's important to communicate with those different partners, with those different stakeholders, so that everybody develops a common understanding on which to move forward together. Another important aspect that Shizuru raised is the question of negative subsidies and the need for policy realignments. I think that oftentimes, although there's a lot happening in this space, and especially for us parliamentarians who have to look at legislation and whether different entities are complying to this legislation, have to look at public spending and where that public spending goes, it's sometimes difficult for us to recognize how a subsidy that may have value for society is actually a negative subsidy when it comes to achieving sustainability. And I think we need, you mentioned it's not just about financial partnerships, it's also about technical partnerships. We need those technical partnerships, and we need you to support us in helping us better understand, those linkages and how to understand the decisions that we make from a legislative, from a budgetary standpoint. John, I very much appreciated, I forget if it was John or Ahmad, but you mentioned about navigating the politics at the domestic level. I think that's very important. I think that sometimes the politics are overlooked. We focus on the technical aspects, we focus on compliance, a little about those realities that actually potentially shape the reality, shape implementation a lot more than the technical aspects do. So I think this is an area where you as technical and financial partners, we as legislators who aren't only at this higher institutional level developing policies, laws, and budgets, but we also have a representation mandate where we actually have deep ties in the communities. And so it is important that we have those dialogues to really understand what is at stake from a political standpoint, what is at stake in reality on the ground, beyond the laws, beyond the project proposals, beyond the documents and the frameworks. Again, I think that all that you've said, I think is quite clear, and I think my biggest takeaway is that we need to have more conversations. I believe there is complementarity in the roles that we play, and I think what we would like as a network is to create more opportunities like this one to really speak to you, and also to give you the opportunity to stand in front of parliamentarians in the different countries in which you operate and really explain to them how they can, first of all, the impact that your work is having. I mean, you're talking about, interventions, 34 to 1, 101 to 1. It sounds, it's mind-boggling to really think of the scale you're talking about, the magnitude, and the potential of that impact. And I think for us parliamentarians who are often stuck in the sort of real politics and the day-to-day, it is important for us to be able to step back and to see these are some of the things that are happening. This is where we can really have an impact beyond what we're looking at today. So creating these opportunities for you to give that same message to parliamentarians and to other stakeholders at the national level and at the sub-regional level would be a fantastic opportunity. The final thing I would say is maybe I will take this opportunity to say my final message in French. So, because nous sommes effectivement au pavillon de la Commission climat du bassin du Congo, donc c'est important de parler également en français pour l'auditoire français qui nous écoute, pour dire qu'en réalité, les opportunités d'impact sont là. Nous avons le Fonds bleu pour le bassin du Congo, qui a énormément de projets, mais projets qui aujourd'hui peinent à trouver des financements. Et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons eu des éléments de réponse pour mieux cibler nos plaidoyers en faveur du Fonds bleu. Il s'agit réellement de voir comment nous pouvons davantage utiliser nos ressources nationales pour justement satisfaire un certain nombre de critères qui ont été présentés ici pour justement attirer ces différents investisseurs, les rassurer, réduire les risques qui peuvent peut-être les démotiver. Et également, nous aussi poser des actes qui vont renforcer les capacités des acteurs sur le terrain pour être davantage dans aligné avec les exigences de ces différentes initiatives. Donc c'est pour dire tout simplement que l'espoir est permis. Je remercie une dernière fois tous nos participants, Rachel, John, Ahmad, Mohamed. Merci infiniment pour la pertinence de vos propos et disons le pragmatisme avec lequel vous avez parlé de ces problématiques. Il y a beaucoup de choses à dire sur les opportunités de financement, mais encore une fois, l'espoir est permis et je pense qu'avec tout ce que nous avons appris aujourd'hui, nous pouvons espérer que la Commission climat du bassin du Congo, le Fonds bleu et tous nos pays de la sous-région qui ne profitent pas encore de ce type d'initiative trouveront à présent les moyens de lancer ce type d'initiative et de voir l'impact que ça peut avoir dans nos pays. Donc une fois de plus, merci Oshani for your moderating. Thank you panelists for all your fantastic messages and brilliant insights. And I look forward to our next conversations. Thank you very much. So I believe this is the end.